Hello and welcome to Saunders on Security, brought to you by Corinium Global Intelligence. Today, I have a fantastic guest, and we are, as usual, going to be talking security and everything you need to know as the busy CISO. Today, I'm welcoming Jason Jordaan to our interview. And Jason, I think, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us where you come from, how you got into this, and what you're passionate about in the space of security.
Awesome. Thanks, Ross. So thanks for the great introduction. It's always great to chat to you. Known you for a couple of years now, so it's always nice to catch up, especially with this sort of weird COVID world where instead of sitting for a cup of coffee at a coffee shop somewhere in Sandton or Rosebank, we've got to do it all online. But yeah, so obviously I've been doing my area of specialization is digital forensics, incident response, and pretty much cybercrime investigation. I suppose in a weird roundabout way, you could say that my passion is catching bad guys. I've kind of been like that since I left school. I joined the South African Police Service, worked in the commercial branch doing mostly white collar crime cases, and of course being the resident geek within the unit that I worked at. Anything that came in that sort of remotely looked like it had anything to do with computers, it was like, Jason, that's your baby to work on. Nice. You go figure it out. And so I was sort of at the sort of real ground level when it came to digital forensics. Obviously, as a geek and nerd at school, I was very into home computing and hacking and all of those kind of things. So it was just kind of a natural fit for me to get into digital forensics. And then from the police, I moved on to the special investigating unit, where I ended up leaving in 2014 as the national head of the cyber forensics laboratory, and I decided to open up my own practice. So I'm kind of really passionate about all things forensics and all things cybercrime and cyber investigations and things along those lines. And I've been quite privileged in the sense from a career point of view that, with my involvement with the SANS Institute, I've now been teaching digital forensics around the world. As a young police officer, I always had these dreams and passions of one day going over to the FBI Academy and becoming an FBI agent. Then obviously, the reality of like you have to be a US citizen didn't kind of hit home at the time. But the strange, ironic sense of sort of twist of fate, now instead of being a FBI agent, I end up teaching FBI agents, in digital forensics. So life has a strange sense of irony, but so this is really what I love. I love all things sort of forensic related, anything that we can do to improve catching the bad guys. And I think that's really the topic of our discussion today is in terms of the cybercrime bill and the impact that has in South Africa. And I must be honest, I'm super excited about it. This is something we've been working on for a really, really, really long time. So I'm eager to chat about it.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly where we're going to dive in. I mean, we've been hearing about Poppy for a long time and cybercrimes, but cybercrime seems to have been the quieter cousin in the corner. And I mean, with me working on Poppy, it is sort of, I almost see it as a sister-law, I suppose, or a complementary one. But that's very much what we're going to go through today. So, Jason, perhaps take us through what is the cybercrimes bill exactly, because it does affect everyone here.
Well, I think we've got to go a little bit back in time to sort of kind of get to the point. So before the introduction of the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act in 2002, there was a lot of movement in South Africa about how do we criminalize hacking and, all these kind of offenses. And the South African Law Commission was involved with a project looking at developing cybercrime legislation. But it was this kind of really weird topsy-turvy sort of the internet boom time, .coms were all over the place and the world was going crazy. And, I think we kind of ended up developing a piece of legislation, which eventually became the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, which kind of had the cybercrime stuff sort of tacked in on the back end. Like, well, we needed to put something in, so we'll just stick it together. And it was a bit of a disaster. I mean, the law was fairly decent, but, there were certain things in it like the creation of cyber inspectors, and it created huge confusion over who did what and how, and it was just a non-entity, to be quite blunt about it. But the whole purpose of us having to legislate cybercrime in terms of actually having legislation on the books dealing with cybercrime is the fact that South Africa is a signatory to the Berne Convention, which basically, we talk about the European Community Convention on Cybercrime. So South Africa is a signatory of that treaty, but we've never actually formally ratified it. So there's always been, in the back end at a political level, this real strong need for South Africa to have a piece of legislation would allow us to ratify the treaty, would then become, the treaty would become in force in South Africa, and that would be really important. And the reason for this being so important is, I mean, as you know, and obviously as many of your viewers will know as well, the reality is that cybercrime is a transnational crime. It's a borderless crime. So the only way you can effectively address it, especially at the level we see it currently in business, is you need to have this transnational approach. You need to have legislation that transposes national boundaries and actually allows us to do it. And the cybercrime bill was effectively the mechanism developed by the Department of Justice to kind of bring us in line with that convention. And that's sort of the historical basis of what led to the development of the cybercrime bill. As the cybercrime bill was initially developed by the Department of Justice, the Deputy Minister of Justice actually brought together an advisory panel of specialists from a number of different disciplines. He brought in legal specialists, he brought in forensic specialists such as myself. There were representatives from the police, from justice, from civil society. And that advisory board actually helped in craft the final version of the bill that was ultimately put forward to Parliament, or at least to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Justice the first time. And that advisory board has been quite actively involved in how the bill is developed. And the bill went through some very interesting stages, as I'm sure will come out in the interview. But that's
certainly
really
been an evolution.
that's really the history of the bill. And obviously we're now at a point of view where the bill has gone through Parliament the last time. Hopefully it's now on its way to the President for signature. So, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that hopefully 2021 starts off well with a brand new piece of legislation, which and to be very honest, I think it's actually a fairly good piece of legislation, especially if you just look at the pure legalistic framework of it. But that's basically in a nutshell the broad history of the bill. And like I said, I know we're going to explore things a lot more deeper, some of the pitfalls and hills and valleys that we had to cross to get it to where it is now.
Absolutely. So I mean, there is so much to it, I think, as well. There's the protection aspect of people. We've spoken about it evolving quite a bit now. You mentioned that. But what are some of the core things that are going to affect the business from the cybercrimes bill?
Well, from a business perspective, and obviously there were. If the bill had stayed in its original format, well, I can't say it was its original format. Shall I say its second original format? It would have had a huge impact on business. But as the bill currently stands, there's two. I would like to say almost like two critical areas where it could impact on business. Obviously, this is not necessarily an impact on business, but it certainly does help benefit us in the long run. Is it criminalizes a lot of conduct in a far more easy to understand manner. The offenses are far more clearly defined, which is great from a legal point of view. It makes prosecution that much easier. Obviously, that doesn't have a huge impact on businesses, except that businesses now have some legal prosecution options, if they are victims of cyber crimes. But where the bill does impact a lot on businesses in South Africa currently is two ways. So firstly, if an investigation is undertaken, there is an obligation on the businesses to actually cooperate with the authorities doing that investigation. So you can't just, the police rock up at your door and sort of come knocking on your door and saying, oh, we had to do an investigation and we want you to help us with survey X. You actually have an obligation to assist them, and failing to actually help them could itself be construed as a criminal offense. But that being said as well, just to be completely honest about it, would you really want the authorities coming and poking around your server infrastructure and things along those lines and accidentally killing critical business processes? So it's kind of a good way, but the irony is the way the law had been construed often in the past. If the police came with a search warrant, you actually were not allowed to help them because you weren't named on the warrant. So even if it was your own infrastructure, your ability to help them would have been retarded by the actual search warrant itself. So it was kind of a bit of a messy situation. So this cleans that up, at least from that perspective. And then the second aspect, which I think that really impacts on businesses, is certain classes of businesses have a reporting obligation to report cybercrime events. So as the act currently, or shall I say, as the bill currently stands, if you are in the financial industry, or if you are what is termed in the bill an electronic communications provider. So if you're an ISP or providing any kind of fiber backbone or any of those kind of things, you would potentially fall in that definition. Now, what that means is that if you become aware of a cybercrime offense, or offense as defined in the cybercrime bill, there would be a reporting obligation on you to actually report that to the authorities. Now, as the bill currently stands, that will all be contained in regulations, which obviously haven't been written yet. So we don't know exactly how that process is going to work. But we anticipate that it'll be probably something similar to what we currently see in the Prevention and Combating Corrupt Activities Act, which places a reporting obligation on certain categories of persons and businesses to report certain instances of fraud, theft, and corruption. Again, we'll see what the regulation says. So that'll be the impact on business, and then coupled with that is the obligation of businesses to actually store and retain evidence of these offences and make the best attempt to actually store that evidence.
Well, surely that's going to make a bit of a challenge for businesses, because I mean, handling evidence and things like that can be a challenge at the best of time and retaining.
Well, I've thought about it from a lot of perspectives, obviously from a legal perspective and a practical perspective. Now, if you think about it, we already, from a business compliance perspective, we already require organizations to retain documentary proof anyway. So if you look in terms of the Income Tax Act, for example, or the financial records you're obligated to keep for so many years, that's evidence. It's paper evidence. So it's not something that businesses are actually, it's not something foreign to businesses. We just need to wrap our heads around it slightly differently to what we actually normally do in business anyway. The obligation is now to keep electronic records. Now, if you think about it, most of those financial records are already electronic records anyway. So a lot of these records are kind of intermingled. I think the challenge is going to be in terms of how businesses keep these records. Now, obviously, I'm a forensic practitioner. I want businesses to keep as many records as possible, because at the end of the day, it makes it easier for us to do an investigation. And it's kind of a catch-22 situation. If you cannot keep the records, and then an incident happens, it needs an investigation. That investigation takes 10 times as long, it costs 20 times as much, versus you spend a bit of money up front for the proper data retention, storage is in place, and an incident happens, the investigation's done in a week, and it costs, a tenth of what it would normally. So, there's so many different ways of looking at it. But again, I suppose some of the interesting dynamics coming to play is how does that interface with the Protection of Personal Information Act? And the whole responsibilities of your data controllers and the rights of data subjects. So it's
sometimes not retaining information.
It's sometimes not retaining information. So it's actually it's an exciting time from a cyber law perspective, because we don't know exactly how the law is going to play out. I mean, the acts are fairly clear, but obviously it'll come down to the interpretation in court. So that's kind of exciting. I know it leaves a lot of people very apprehensive, thinking like, oh, it's this great unknown. But for somebody like myself, it's a great opportunity, because we're now actually in a position where we have good laws, and now we just need to get good cases on the books that help drive the laws and develop the law further. So yeah, I'm actually looking forward to it. I don't know if all businesses are though, but we certainly are.
That'll be something to be seen. So you mentioned there about evolutions of the law, and you say it's an exciting time and you think it's quite a good law. What have been some of the evolutions over time of this as it is now? Like what's the challenges been?
So one of the biggest challenges that there were probably two big challenges. Well, okay, I think in hindsight, there's probably more than two big challenges, but the biggest challenge that we had right in the front with the laws, this bill was initially called the Cybercrime and Cybersecurity Bill. Now, you've almost got to step back a bit to understand how the legislative process works. You know, yes, government will introduce legislation for debate in Parliament, but the development of that legislation is usually driven by a government department. So the cybercrime aspect of the bill had been driven by the Department of Justice, rightfully so, because they are the custodians of criminal law in South Africa. That would be expected. And knowing the guys behind that part of the bill, they really did a good job. They did extensive research on it. I mean, this wasn't just something plucked out of nowhere. The researchers at the department looked at legislation all over the world. It was really well researched. But then at the same token, we found ourselves in a weird position in South Africa with the securitocrats kind of wanting to dominate the discourse and everything. And the cybersecurity part was tacked on to the bill that the Department of Justice was developing, and that came from the State Security Agency. So in other words, from our security services, our intelligence services. And, you know, obviously there's a lot to be said about what was going on in there at the time. We were facing issues where the state was trying to force through like a secrecy bill, and you know, and how that was shot down, and then they tried to bring in backdoors through the cybersecurity part of it. But the gist of the cybersecurity bill, or the cybersecurity section of the bill, is it pretty much gave the State Security Agency control over everything cyber related in South Africa. They could dictate terms, they could define security standards, they could pretty much tell you and your business what to do, they could tell you who to appoint to audit your systems, and if you didn't, there were consequences. It was exceptionally draconian. And this hit a huge sticking point when it got into civil society. So a lot of the NGOs that were involved in the process of commenting on the bill, and even those of us that were on the advisory board were like, this is bad. This is really bad. We've seen this. I mean, the only place you see that kind of draconian type legislation is in countries like China and Russia and places like that. And again, no disrespect to any of those countries. Obviously, their political systems are different. But in South Africa, in a constitutional democracy, those are not the kind of things you actually want to see in a piece of legislation. So there was a massive battle. I mean, the battle lines were literally drawn between government on one side saying this bill will pass in this form, and civil society on the other hand saying there is no way in hell we're going to let the bill pass in this form. And, you know, again, I mean, this was the first bill that I've ever been sort of really deeply involved in the development of the legislation, even though I've been in government service for a long time. But this is the first time I actually saw the impact and the power that civil society has. And when I say civil society, I'm talking about united civil society. It wasn't just, you know, it wasn't like 20 different NGOs all pulling in different directions. This was one unified, united voice saying this is bad for our country. And at the end of the day, you know, after we had our first set of briefings before the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Justice, the decision was made to actually strip out the cybersecurity section from the bill altogether, because the simple fact of the matter is that this was such a sticking point. It was actually retarding the ability of South Africa ratifying the Cybercrime Convention, because we needed to ratify that. We needed to ratify that to be in good standing in the sort of global law enforcement community. But the cyber security thing that had been tacked on to effectively give control over cyber infrastructure and goodness knows what else all was just totally compromising it. So having that removed was a huge victory for us. And you know, and I take my hat off to all of the NGOs and the activists and the people that submitted representations into the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee. It was a huge undertaking, and you know, it was quite humbling for somebody who'd never been on that side of the process to actually see South Africans coming together in such numbers to actually put together and recommend how do we fix something. It wasn't just this is bad, it must go away. We actively said this part is bad, this part is good. How can we make the good part better? And we were all very relieved when the Department of Justice eventually acquiesced and said, well, okay, we're going to remove the cybersecurity section from that. And after that pretty much cleared the way for how we could move forward. I mean, just the reality is that it would have so dramatically impacted the cybersecurity landscape in South Africa. It would have been insane. It would have been completely unworkable. It would have been completely draconian. It's not something that would have worked in a constitutional democracy at all.
Yeah, I think previously when I was looking at it, there was a lot of, I think, panic around the fact that the bill or the act could be weaponized against competitors and things like that, because of the I suppose, ratting on someone basically.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that now? Has that gotten a bit better? Or?
So one of the big challenges that was raised, especially from the InfoSec community in South Africa, and rightfully so, was that there were certain ways that the initial draft of the bill had been written that if you, for example, were in possession of, let's just for argument's sake, you went and downloaded Kali from kalilinux.org, which we all know is an offensive security Linux distro. If you downloaded that, technically you were violating the law. You were a criminal. That's how.
I'm just going to go delete something quickly.
I don't worry. I can show you how to delete stuff. So I'm not going to get it back. Anyway, I joke. But it was written that way, and amongst the security industry, there was a lot of legitimate concern, and obviously, with me being really actively involved in the information security community in South Africa, a lot of people had approached me and said, look, Jason, we know that you're very involved with this bill. Here are our concerns. How do we address this? And we actually did representations where lots of people from the information security in South Africa actually put together representations addressing this very issue. So the final wording of the bill means that if you are in possession of one of these tools, if I can put it this way, you have to actually prove that you were in possession or using the tool for malicious purposes. Now, and I know a lot of people still get panicky about that, but we've also got to look at this from a legalistic point of view. We've already had that in South African legislation for many, many years. I'm trying to remember, I think it was the second Criminal Procedure or Criminal Law Amendment Act introduced offenses like possession of burglary tools, for example. So, if you were walking down the middle of the road in a suburb late at night and you were carrying your duffel bag and inside it was hacksaws and screwdrivers, and I suppose these days would be signal jammers and, and you couldn't explain why you were there, that was an offense. So we've already had similar crimes on our statute books for a while that have been quite easily accepted, by everybody in South Africa. So the way that it's now worded, I think is quite acceptable. And, I know there's still some people in the information security community that get a bit frustrated and say, but, we could be arrested. Well, I mean, we've also got to accept that we're not in a perfect world. Our law is good, but it doesn't mean that there are not instances in the law where the law could be abused. Let's be honest, we see the law abused every day. You're driving along the road and a traffic cop pulls you over. You have to have a justified, the traffic cop is allowed to do that in terms of the Road Transport Act, but there has to be a justifiable rationale for them exercising that power. And most often when you turn around and say, well, what was I being pulled over for? You get I'm the traffic cop, I don't need to tell you, blah, 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 blah. I mean, that's an abuse of power. Yeah. The problem is not with the law. The problem is with the enforcers of the law. So I think a lot of the concerns that people might still have, even with the bill in the current form, is that it could still be abused, but any law could be abused.
And I think that's why we've got that's why we have a court. It's not like worst case scenario, you're going to get arrested and they throw away the key immediately. That's not how our system works. I mean, you've still got to go into court, and if it's a criminal proceeding, you're going to have that much more weight on the evidence and things to prove it.
Exactly.
So
you know, there's, like I said, it's not a bad act from that perspective. It does give us certain it gives the legal authority or law enforcement authorities certain additional powers. But I just wanted to check something. There was so a lot of the things when it talks about you know, the powers that the police officials use, it also criminalizes, and this is something that this bill does that a lot of these other laws don't do, is it actually criminalizes the conduct of police officials in terms of this bill who misuse the sections in the bill. So for example, in section 29(3), it basically says a police officer or an investigator who contravenes or fails to comply with subsection 1 or 2, and 1 and 2 basically talks about if they operate contrary to the standard operating procedures, or in terms of how they do searches and seizures and how they use private information and things along those lines. If they contravene that, that's a criminal offense with, which is liable on conviction to a fine or imprisonment for a period not exceeding 2 years, or both a fine and such imprisonment. So let's just talk about weaponizing the act. I have my local police friend and I say, hey, you know what, you know, I've got this thing against Ross. I think you need to stop Ross. You know, you got to pull him over the roadblock, and when you get his laptop, you got to search his laptop, and then you know, I'll give you $500 and you can give me a copy of all the information on his laptop. Well, if I do that now, I'm going to prison. I mean, that's a crime, you know, and that's what's nice with this bill is that yeah, there's certain things that where it could potentially be weaponized, but there's enough checks and balances in it. So like, for example, like obviously we can get, I say we, it's like I'm still in the police, but you know, if you're a law enforcement official, you can now get verbally consented search warrants. The process is in there. But again, what's nice about this is there is a specific section in terms of 38 of the bill, which says if you provide false information under oath or affirmation to get a search warrant or any of these kind of things, that's a criminal offense. You know, previously, if you did that in terms of other legislation, it would be considered statutory perjury. Now we say, no. If you've done that, forget the perjury part. The simple act of giving that false information is, so if you've got a police officer now who lies to get a preservation order, sorry for that police officer, that's a criminal offense. So I'm actually really quite impressed with the checks and balances that the bill actually has in place from that perspective. It gives a lot more power. I mean, and he has a simple thing. Now obviously I do forensic investigations. My company does forensic investigations. So if we, I mean, again, and this is a very broad reading of the Act, but in terms of 39, it pretty much includes us that if we have information in our possession that we obtain during the course of our duties, and we don't produce it, or we share it without authorization and things along those lines, we can be prosecuted. You know, so again, that for me also ties in quite nicely in a sense with the Protection of Personal Information Act, which now, I mean, even though the Protection of Personal Act places a positive duty on a data controller or a data processor to preserve the data, it goes deeper, especially from an offense point of view. So if I'm investigating a forensic matter, that I actually have even more responsibilities in terms of this act as well. I really find that exciting, because there's nothing that upsets me more than these fly-by-night PI kind of guys that are getting information left, right, and center. And, you know, I'm just going to phone up my chummy in the bank quickly and get your bank account details. Well, no, we can't do that. We can't be bad guys to catch bad guys. Doesn't work that way.
Very well put. Very well put. Yeah. No, I'm glad there are those checks and balances in there. That's great. It's great. I think we could probably talk about these different sections for ages, but I want to bring us back to the CISOs. And so what kind of things in this act should a CISO be aware of as we're starting to come to the end of our conversation?
So I think from a CISO point of view, so obviously your chief information security officer has a obligation, usually at a board level or some kind of executive level, to the overall information security posture of the organization. So, you know, if you throw in this bill, if you throw in Protection of Personal Information Act and everything else, they have a huge onus and duty on them. Now, if you look at, and I'm going to start with the Protection of Personal Information Act, because it's something that I think you can't really talk about both of these without looking at one. Section 19 of the Protection of Personal Information Act sets out a very clear responsibility for any person who processes any personally identifiable information to have the relevant security systems in place. Now we often think about security systems from a preventative kind of prevention aspect. But I think CISOs need to take it one step further and say, well, actually, what if there is a breach? You know, and they should have their own systems. I would like to say forensically ready. Now, I'm not saying every CISO needs to have a team of digital forensic specialists and things along those lines, but their systems have to be engineered in such a capacity that getting evidence in the instance of a breach or an incident that would be criminalized in terms of the cybercrime bill could be adequately investigated. And again, the reason why I say that is because if there is an incident and the authorities come in to investigate, they can effectively take control, you know, by directing your staff members and things along those lines to collect evidence. So that can be incredibly disruptive on business operations. So if I want to make sure, I've already been, my organization's already been victimized by a cybercrime incident, I want to minimize the disruptions to my business as much as possible, because, you know, if my business is disrupted, that has a bottom line impact on the balance sheet, effectively on our profit and loss statement. So the last thing I want is, I don't want my chief executive officer, my chief operations officer on my neck saying, hey, you're costing us R1 million a day kind of thing. So we need to engineer our systems in such a way that if there is an incident, we have the ability to react ourselves to that incident in the most cost-effective and efficient way as possible without disrupting our business operations. So that's the one aspect that I think. So I think a lot of that is going to come into play once the standard operating procedures that are discussed in the Act come into play. But once those are clear and they're published, then CISOs will actually kind of know what they should be doing. And, you know, again, for those organizations that already, you know, that already understand the ISO 27000 series of ISO standards, we do have a number of ISO standards relating to cybercrime and investigation. So 27037 and those kind of standards are the kind of standards that would help frame that discussion. And then the second aspect, and again, that's also only going to really become an issue once the regulations come into play, is the reporting obligation. So if you are a financial, you know, you in the financial industry, or you are an electronic communication service provider, you will have a legal obligation to report. So if you are a CISO for an organization like that, you'd have to make sure you have the processes and procedures in place. Now, this is also where it kind of gets interesting, because when those regulations get passed, they also at some point going to have to tie into the Protection of Personal Information Act as well, with the reporting obligations there, because 9 times out of 10, any compromise is going to involve personally identifiable information. And as you'll know, in South Africa, even your company information is considered personally identifiable information, unlike in Europe with GDPR, where it's only individuals. So the reality is this is going to be quite a challenge, I think, for CISOs to actually bring together. But I think those are for me probably the two most pertinent things to kind of realize is CISOs need to ensure that their systems are forensically ready and are robust enough for evidence collection and storage, so that the state doesn't come and do it for them and potentially disrupt business operations. And for those organizations that there would be a legal reporting obligation, to be ready for that once the regulations are passed. But I don't think, I mean, at the grand scheme of things, I don't think CISO should necessarily be like stressing like they have been with the Protection of Personal Information Act kind of thing. Because if you think about it, if you comply with a lot of the aspects in terms of the Protection of Personal Information Act, especially around things like Section 19, you'd actually cover a lot of this as well. You'd maybe just need to extend some of those definitional aspects in the Protection of Personal Information Act to cover these little additional checks and balances, and I think you'd actually be fine.
Yeah, I think this would tie nicely into things like your data protection policy and
Yeah.
things like that you're running in a business.
Yeah, exactly.
And we were talking about retentions earlier as well. So your retention policies, I think that all ties in well. And a lot of the stuff in Section 19 is a requirement to get insurance anyway, if you want to get cyber insurance. So,
exactly.
Yeah, that's a lot less of a stress, I think, than it could be.
No, I think with a lot of legislation, a lot of us, we see it and we stress. We almost have like a knee-jerk reaction because we look at it in terms of how people are going to use the legislation as opposed to just what does the legislation say. And, in my reading of the legislation, I'm really quite comfortable with it. It's not perfect by any means. No legislation is perfect, but it's a damn good piece of legislation. And, and I think that's something that we in South Africa can actually be fairly proud of. Our laws are actually pretty good. Our enforcement of them, however, maybe not so much so, but our laws are pretty good. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. So I'm always looking for the silver lining in that cloud every single time.
No, great. Yeah, I mean, I've even got more comfort with it now just after chatting to you. But as we're approaching the end here, something I ask for from all of my guests, and it's a bit broader, I think, than perhaps just the cybercrimes bill, is if you had to suggest some kind of quick win for security in an organization, what would your quick win be for an organization?
I know this is going to sound really, really, really crazy, but please, actually two things. I'm going to ask for two things because they're really two simple things, so I think I can get away with it. The first is please, whatever you do, disable local admin accounts on your endpoints. 99.99% of the intrusion cases that I investigate, that is exactly how the systems are compromised. There is a local account with admin rights on that system. Get rid of them. Don't have them. And if it's the executive saying, but I need to be able to be admin so I can download the latest widgets, no. Just say no. Be like Nike. Just say no. No, Nike's just do it. What's the one that just say no? Drugs. Yeah, just like drugs. Don't do it. Just say no. And then the second one comes down to passwords. Please, if I could wave a magic wand and make security better, please do away with complex passwords. I mean, we've created passwords that are so complex for human beings to remember, but they're so trivial for computers to crack. So, you know what? I know a lot of people don't like to hear this, but length counts, guys. I mean, this is one of those ones where the longer the better. Doesn't have to be complex; it just has to be long. And if you're going to use passphrases, use 20, 30, 40 character passphrases. We have not built the rainbow tables that could actually compute the hashes for those kind of passwords yet. So we 40, 50, 60 years away from even cracking those kind of passwords. So those would be my two quick wins. No local admin accounts. Make sure you have long passwords. Make them easy for you to remember. That's absolutely fine. You don't have to have, squiggle, full stop, underscore, 13, uppercase F, G, H, Z, 27. You don't need that because you're going to write that thing down. You're going to use a password manager. Have a long passphrase. And hell, if your favorite movie is The Sound of Music and you want to make your password doe a deer, female deer, ray a drop of golden sun, go try and crack that password. I dare you. It's going to take you years to crack that, but you'll remember it, and that's really what we're after.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of passphrases. So I've got my password manager that I use, that just because I can't remember that many passwords, even if they are phrases. But then where I can, passphrases, just like 4 words separated by a dash or something is suddenly this 17 character thing, 34 character.
There's that famous I think it's that XKCD comic,
yeah.
which I think it's what Battery Horse Staple or something, you know. And that's really what it comes down to. I mean, just pick 3 random words that you're going to remember with a space between each one of them. Oh, you got an awesome password.
Yeah. We just need companies to start supporting that in their forms, because some companies still have the requirements.
You see, that's the problem. And again, and this comes back to what I was, I say this quite often. With a lot of security standards that are out there, the compliance standards, we are defending ourselves against auditors. We're not defending ourselves against criminals. So my compliance standard says I need to have a password that's 9 characters long. It must have a number, a letter, uppercase, lowercase. So I build my systems to comply with that complexity rule. But then when I want to put in a 50-character password that's all normal letters, it throws out, so no, you violated the complexity rules. But as complexity rules stand, that 50-character password is by light years way more complex than that 9-character password. Yeah. And that's maths. The maths doesn't lie. We are our biggest failures in our security systems, because we talk too much about compliance issues and not about actual security issues. And again, that's a personal pet peeve, maybe a discussion for a completely different day. But yeah, that's really what it is. We need to start thinking smarter. And the reality is, again, looking at the cases that we've investigated, if you just had to have proper passwords in place, and if you had to have no local admin accounts, you'd probably mitigate about 70 to 80% of the actual attacks out there.
Oh, wow.
I mean, when I say that, it really is that simple. The last breach we investigated, the password on a local admin account, which hadn't been disabled, which also happened to exist on every single system, was admin 1234.
That's cringeworthy.
but the fact that we're still seeing those, and the fact that that's how the systems are being abused, it's just two simple things.
That's nothing new. That's 20 years.
None of this is going to stop all crime, but you know what? It's going to mean that you're only going to be attacked by nation state attackers and really, really dedicated attackers, and that's fine, because you know what? If you've been attacked by Russia or China or whatever, then you do have a problem. That's the reality. Then you got a problem, because they have massive resources on their head. But you don't want to be attacked by some Joe Blog West African syndicate guy that's sitting in a warehouse in Lagos, attacking you. If I can stop that attack, why the hell shouldn't I?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's trivial to do. And then that's my what I would like to do to make the world a bit of a safer place.
Fantastic. And I'd like to see that too. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. This has been very exciting. I think you and I could probably talk about these subjects for hours on end.
Oh, definitely.
But we do have to wrap up. If someone wants to get hold of you to find out more, or if they need your services or something, where do they do that?
So they can drop me an email to jason@dfirlabs.com. Obviously, they can go to our website, which is www.dfirlabs.com. Obviously, it's a HTTPS site, so just throwing that out there. And if they want to hit me up on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @DFS_JasonJ. And I'm pretty active. Even if people have just got questions, they just want to bounce an idea off, please phone, drop me an email. Oh, if they want to phone me, I suppose they can. My mobile number is 083-556-7112. Pretty much phone me anytime, because I'm usually at some point around the world. Hopefully post-COVID, I'll be traveling again. But at the end of the day, we just want to try and make the world a bit of a safer place for our family, our kids, and our organizations. So let's not give in. Let's give it a good old try.
Fantastic. Great. Well, Jason, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our listeners for giving us a listen this week, and we will see you again soon. Thank you very much. Cheerio.
Thanks, Ross.